that means something is occurring progressively to the point where it's destroying his hair follicles, some sort of inflammatory issue, the bleeding. If you were to just go into a doctor's office, the doctor would go with the heuristic, right? And just assume this guy's dealing with itching and bleeding. Okay, what the heck is going on? What's going on with this guy? So in all seriousness,
Hey guys, before we continue this video, I would like to mention that we now have liposomal monoxidil sulfate on my website, folligens.com, FOLLIGENZ.com.
Go check it out and maybe even try it out. See you there. Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we're on Reddit. We're looking at this particular user. The title of the post is, quote, 8 months Fin, 1 year min, is it working or below baseline, 20-year-old male, diffuse plus retrograde / all over pattern, switch to Dutasteride, unquote. And the Reddit user is Sam's to Goat. I guess I'll just call him Sam's for the purpose of this video. So let's look at the description, his little body of text over here. He writes, quote, should I hop on Dutasteride instead? First 2 pictures now, last 2 pictures a year ago. I was losing hair all over, so I hopped on finasteride, minoxidil, and also vitamin D to help stop my scalp from itching and bleeding. Okay, I used clobetasol for a bit, and it helped too. Now I don't have an itchy or bleeding scalp anymore, but I think my hair looks quite sparse. It feels like it thins / sheds every week. And my nape has gotten quite thin. I exfoliate my scalp, and that has helped as well. Also helped stop shedding any hair in my eyebrows. What? Okay, whatever. But I want to regrow my hair. I started with more hair than a lot of people who get insane results. This just feels unfair, unquote. Now, what the fuck is going... Oh, sorry. I gotta stop swearing. What the heck is going on? What's going on with this guy? So in all seriousness, look, if you're having an itchy, bleeding scalp, do you really think that's androgenetic alopecia, right? Like, okay, I know a lot of people don't obsess about this like I do, right? But itching and bleeding sounds pretty severe. When you accompany that with hair loss, that's even more concerning. So it's not to say that he doesn't have androgenetic alopecia. He could, right? He could have some sort of comorbid, hodgepodge, crazy thing going on, right? But the itching and bleeding in and of itself is a sign of some kind of barrier disruption. So is it even wise to use whatever sort of exfoliating agent that he's using on his scalp, right? I want you guys to think about this real quick, because there are some people who, you know, when they're not getting results on Fin and Min, they'll go on Reddit, and then somebody on Reddit will say, well, I think you should use tretinoin, and you should also use microneedling at the same time. What if you are somebody that already has like an issue similar to eczema, right? Or seborrheic dermatitis, or psoriasis, or maybe sebopsoriasis. I'll try to put some pictures of these conditions while I'm talking about it. Hopefully I don't forget to edit that in. But if you're dealing with those kinds of issues where you already have a barrier disruption, right, and you probably already have flakes, but it's, you know, in some conditions, the flakes aren't due to dandruff. It's due to your literal skin breaking off and flaking, the barrier breaking off and flaking. You need to be wise about what advice you take, and also, you know, how you go about treating your particular issue, right? So if you throw tretinoin or some kind of exfoliating agent on a barrier that's already disrupted, you're going to run into some pretty, you know, severe issues, right? And this guy probably has some sort of issue, right? And that issue, of course, is a bleeding scalp. An itchy, bleeding scalp, probably the barrier is disrupted or compromised in some way. And on top of that, he's definitely getting some kind of bacterial infiltrate into deeper layers of his skin, simply because now his barrier is exposed. It's going to leave him, a tad bit more compromised. So another issue that I see is that, he's losing hair in a retrograde pattern. We'll see if he shows that. But also he's losing hair in his nape, as he said. And more alarmingly, he's losing hair in his eyebrows. Now, guys, with all of that, does that sound like androgenetic alopecia? If you're also losing hair in your eyebrows, this sounds like some kind of autoimmune condition. But anyway, enough of the yapping. Let's have a look at the scalp. So he says the first two pictures, right, are now. So he's doing a now versus a then kind of thing. So this picture, as you can see here, if he were to just go into a doctor's office, the doctor would go with the heuristic, right, and just assume this guy's dealing with male pattern baldness, especially if he doesn't use a dermatoscope or any sort of investigative tools to see what's going on the scalp. Now, to be fair, if you're not looking up close at the scalp and you're just looking at it visually, you'd probably go with the androgenetic alopecia bet, right? But when you take into account everything else he's saying, it's probably not just androgenetic alopecia. At the very least, he probably has something else along with it. And the eyebrow hair loss is something that immediately screams that. But again, looking at his scalp, the midsection, seems like it's, it does have some hair here and there, so recovery is possible. Some miniaturized hairs, but they're still metabolically active. There are some gaps here and there, but I think he could make a recovery if he takes the proper treatment and he acts quickly, right? He has to get onto the treatment as soon as possible, especially if he has an autoimmune hair loss condition that seems to be a scarring condition from what he's describing. The loss of the eyebrows, the bleeding and the itching. Even if it's like seborrheic dermatitis, him constantly scratching his scalp, maybe that's what's leading to the bleeding. That can cause fibrosis and destroy some hair follicles over time, right? Aside from the chronic inflammation that's like forcing him to try to itch, those two things are going to contribute to a fibrotic state. I do see some like weird pink scaling, here and here and here, and also here as well. But who knows what that is, right? Maybe that could be the lighting, but something tells me it's definitely like a fibrotic kind of tissue. In any case, if you examine outside of this sort of, area of diffuse loss, he has a lot of strong, wavy, curly hair that could make up for any sort of loss of density in the mid-scalp. He just has to make a slight recovery. But then again, we're looking at how he is currently. Apparently, he was better back then. So let's look at the second picture. And in this second picture, we're looking at a different lighting condition, but also a different angle, right? So he's kind of tilted downward in this sort of global view, not fully global, but a partially global view of his scalp, the top part of his scalp. And here, like you can kind of see, I remember when I was back in high school, people would have this sort of roast session, and they would say to somebody who was balding on the top of their head, they could say, we could see the back of your head just looking through your scalp, right? And although that sounds kind of harsh, it's kind of, representing that in some way, such that he has this dense, frontal region, and then as you look towards the back of, through his scalp, the density just drops off. So his midsection is the primary issue here, at least from the angles he's showing to us. So those were the two pictures of his current state. Now let's look at how things were a year ago. So as you can see, a year ago, his midsection was a bit more dense, right? So this is pretty important. That means something is occurring progressively to the point where it's destroying his hair follicles, some sort of inflammatory issue, the bleeding. It could be androgenetic alopecia, but considering how the other conditions, again, once again, the bleeding, the loss of hair outside of the scalp, so the loss of body hair and eyebrow hair and whatever, that is definitely an issue to note. But yeah, a year ago, the midsection was, the balding area was just in the crown. Now it's kind of expanded outward. That's very concerning. If he doesn't solve this issue as soon as possible, it might just get worse. He might just have it all over his scalp. It might be, donezo for him. Let's go on to the next picture. Okay, so this picture looks way more severe. So I'm assuming this is the baseline of when he had the concern. Then it started to expand outward, right? And now this is the current state. Now, it's tough to say if he improved because, again, this last picture in the camera roll is of him sometime last year, right? And although the lighting is a bit different, it does look more severe here than it does like over here, again, and also maybe over here, but it could just be a lighting issue. But I might be making a bit of an assumption there. But still, nevertheless, this guy needs to treat his issue. So let's look at the comment section to see what Sam's has been talking about. Okay, so you have some people asking him if they can get a picture of the size of his hair, and he just responds, Sam's responds, it's thinner, and that he needs to get it faded or it looks bad. But it's much thinner than the top. That's pretty concerning. So if the sides are thinner than whatever is going on in this top section, this midsection, crown and midsection, that means it's pretty shitty, right? Needless to say. Let's see. Somebody makes this very interesting point. A user points out that normal balding shouldn't cause bleeding. And then Sam's responds by saying, quote, I have mild LPP diffuse variant, or at least characteristics of it, according to trichoscopy, plus some body hair loss. I managed to get inflammation down. There are still some other things I plan to try, but it isn't severe, so I want to treat male pattern baldness now, unquote. So I don't know what the hell he's talking about. He's saying, I managed to reduce the inflammation, so it's not an issue anymore. Really? It's not an issue anymore? I don't think he recognizes how severe his situation is, right? The male pattern baldness most likely has already been dealt with. The male pattern baldness aspect of his hair loss, of his alopecia, because, in most cases you take finasteride, you should be doing well. In even more cases, when you take dutasteride, you should be fine. But the fact that he's still losing hair, despite him using finasteride, kind of pushes him towards the direction of maybe his LPP, Lichen Planopilaris, this cicatricial or scarring alopecia, has not been resolved. And that's his true issue at the current moment, right? So he doesn't seem to know what's going on for him to say that, LPP is already, I already dealt with that. I just want to treat male pattern baldness now because that's more, of a severe issue. No, the issue at hand is that your LPP has not been properly addressed. And if it has, then, well, clearly, your hair follicles are in a pretty poor state to properly recover from your finasteride and minoxidil usage. So he's not taking this seriously. Unfortunately, he's not. He has some kind of diffuse variant of LPP. I can't remember at the moment. It's Fibrosing Alopecia in a distributed pattern. I think that's what it's called. And those are some of the hardest classes of LPP to treat, given how expansive it is all over the scalp. And people with that sort of condition, they're not able to get a hair transplant because they don't have a safe area on their scalp and even sometimes on their body to properly, transplant into any sort of recipient area. Both the donor and recipient, or the proposed donor and the recipient areas, are compromised. So I yap all that to say that there are some solutions if you don't want to be like this guy who doesn't seem to be taking his situation seriously. Or let me be polite here, he probably hasn't been informed on what to do properly. Then there are some things to take into account, right? So PDE4 inhibitors, oral or topical, such as Apremilast, has been studied. There are some pretty convincing case reports for treating inflammatory alopecias, particularly cicatricial inflammatory or autoimmune cicatricial inflammatory whatever alopecias. So in this case, Apremilast for Lichen Planopilaris and Frontal Fibrosing Alopecia reduced inflammatory markers, and nearly every patient in this particular case series saw some kind of improvement in hair quality, right? Now, granted, they waited too long. Some of these people waited too long. They were dealing with this issue for maybe a decade or so, but they did see some improvement, whether it was a reduction in inflammatory issues or whether it was an improvement in hair quality, right? Now, it's thought that, and it says it over here in this paper, but there's some literature too, it's thought that Lichen planopilaris is due to a defect in the PPAR-gamma receptor. So the PPAR-gamma receptor is very important when it comes to the metabolism of lipids. And I'll just give the quick rundown. If your body isn't able to properly break down those lipids in certain tissues, this leads to an inflammatory response where your white blood cells start to attack your sebocytes from your sebaceous glands, and then ultimately that sort of chronic inflammatory pattern destroys the sebaceous glands and the surrounding tissue, which ultimately compromises the hair follicle's ability to regenerate itself. So that's a bit of a rundown. But Apremilast, the PDE4 inhibitor, that's also an option. Orally, and I know some people who I've done consults with who take Apremilast orally. Their doctor prescribes it to them to treat Lichen planopilaris, right? But there's also topical PDE4 inhibitors, such as ZORYVE, Roflumilast, and this is a very interesting one. So it's been clinically tested to treat seborrheic dermatitis, psoriasis, I think also eczema as well, right? And it works, again, by inhibiting that enzyme known as PDE4. And PDE4, when you block or lower that enzyme, it causes for cyclic AMP to go up, and naturally cyclic AMP has some anti-inflammatory properties, right? It prevents the signaling of, or rather the excessive signaling of other precursor inflammatory markers. So this is a pretty good topical. I know people that use it. I've used it myself, although it's kind of hard to get a hold of it depending on your doctor and your insurance. At least in the United States, it's really annoying, really hard to get a hold of it. But some people who I've consulted with, they got their hands on it, and it's very good. If you can get your hands on ZORYVE, Roflumilast, topical foam 0.3%, guys, it will do wonders for you. In any case, let's go on to another paper. So this paper, titled, quote, Reversible Hair Loss in a Patient with Cicatricial Alopecia, a Case of Regrowth Associated with Pioglitazone Use, unquote. Here, Pioglitazone is an agonist for the PPAR-gamma receptor. So if you have a defect where your PPAR-gamma receptor is not active enough, and because it's not active enough, it's underactive, or it's not, properly being agonized, then that will cause for you to have a lipid metabolism issue, right? Excessive lipid buildup, your body starts to have issues with getting rid of that lipid or trying to, again, break it down so you can properly have a functioning extracellular matrix. Then you could possibly have issues with fibrosis, right? And we see this sort of issue with lipids and other sort of conditions like atherosclerosis, so on and so forth. And we know that it harms and it causes inflammatory issues if you have these sort of defects. It harms the tissue, right? So pioglitazone actually agonizes the PPAR-gamma receptor. And if a PPAR-gamma defect is what causes or what significantly contributes to autoimmune cicatricial alopecias like Lichen Planopilaris and its other variants like CCCA, Frontal Fibrosing Alopecia, Fibrosing Alopecia in a distributed pattern, then perhaps one could use pioglitazone hydrochloride. And in this, case report, you have a woman who had that issue, right? And granted, she was also using, corticosteroids, low-level light therapy, et cetera, et cetera. But what really moved the needle here is the pioglitazone use, right? So, of course, corticosteroids are going to be important in a stack that treats lichen planopilaris or any sort of its variants, right? Immunosuppressants, or rather immunomodulators, depending on what you use. So, if you use a calcineurin inhibitor like topical tacrolimus, just be careful not to expose yourself to the sun immediately after use. But if you use topical tacrolimus along with, clobetasol propionate, whether shampoo or in solution, along with, keeping up with your 5-alpha reductase inhibitor use, in this case, I would probably say dutasteride, but check with your doctor. And, it's the whole kitchen sink approach, but this is why you want to treat lichen planopilaris as soon as possible, because it is a very severe, illness. But on top of that, you throw in the pioglitazone, and it seems upon throwing in the pioglitazone hydrochloride here, there was an improvement, right? And just look at the picture, side by side. You don't need to do a dermatoscope or tricho scan or whatever to see that there has been an improvement. Clearly, there's been an improvement. So it's not that you can't improve in lichen planopilaris, but time is of the essence, and you have to be quick. Let's go on to another paper here. This is a paper that kind of just looks at the literature when it comes to the response. Well, I'll just read the title. Quote, response of lichen planopilaris to pioglitazone hydrochloride, unquote. And it's just a bit of a literature overview. I'm not going to go over it too much, but I'll leave that in the description for you guys to have a bit of an awareness of what's going on. Because, like I said, pioglitazone is probably very underrated when it comes to its use for lichen planopilaris. It seems to, literature has some signals, right? It's not completely, elaborated on, but there's some decent literature that shows its use does lead to some kind of improvement, right? Unfortunately, we don't have that much topical use, but that does seem like eventually it'll come out, and I might be working on that. Just a bit of a thing I'm doing in the background when it comes to telemedicine, so keep your eye out for that. Another paper I want to look at is this paper over here titled, quote, Lichen planopilaris treated with a Peroxisome Proliferator activated Receptor gamma agonist, unquote. And we get the sort of description of somebody who's been dealing with lichen planopilaris, right? Now, in this particular case report, you have a 47-year-old white man. They specified it. They specified the race, who had a sudden onset of scalp irritation, redness, and itching with rapid hair loss. And his family, he has a history of male pattern hair loss, but this new hair loss just happened suddenly, because before that he was on 1 milligram oral finasteride daily, and it seemed to have been halting his hair loss. But this new hair loss came about rapidly, and it had some sort of patchiness to it, right? And along with using oral antibiotics and topical corticosteroids, they introduced the use of a PPAR-gamma agonist. So it says over here, accordingly, the patient was prescribed an oral PPAR-gamma agonist, pioglitazone hydrochloride, 15 milligram daily orally. He continued to use his anti-seborrheic shampoo. He tolerated the oral medication without adverse effects and reported almost no scalp itching in the first month of treatment. A follow-up examination after 2 months revealed a decrease in the patient's recorded treatment outcomes of symptoms and clinical examination. A scalp biopsy performed after 6 months of therapy showed a dramatic decrease in the inflammatory infiltrate. The patient continued taking oral pioglitazone for 8 months, after which he stopped all treatment. To date, 1 year later, he remains symptom-free without evidence of inflammation or further hair loss on examination. Unquote. So this presents the idea that maybe you just need a short course of pioglitazone hydrochloride, maybe a year to a year and a half. And then after that, you can discontinue and kind of monitor where things are going, right? Because pioglitazone does have its own issues too. I wonder if you can microdose pioglitazone, but it does have its own issues. You can read the literature on that. I'm not going to go into that too heavy. But also the topical use of pioglitazone is very intriguing, along with tretinoin, because both the PPAR-gamma receptor, along with the retinoid receptor, they both come together and form a heterodimer. So in order for you to activate the necessary genes needed to break down lipids or metabolize lipids, what have you, these two things have to form union. So maybe, topical pioglitazone along with a very microdosed topical tretinoin could help, or maybe whatever kind of, RXR agonist you could use. And I know the pictures didn't load in that article, but you can see the improvement, right? So this is the before, this is the after of the same area. You can see that in A, it was very red and inflamed. You have some perifollicular scaling. And then in B, it is kind of still red. You see less of the scaling, if any at all. You don't see anything, to be honest, when it comes to scaling. But you do see the remnants of the inflammatory issue, right? This guy was dealing with some inflammatory issue for months on end, but it's actually pretty cool to see that resolve. So take that into account. And this is the biopsy over here, where you can kind of assess to see what's going on with his lymphocytic infiltrate. That proves he had Lichen Planopilaris. So very good case study to take into account. And now for the fun part. So guys, I've been working on this service called DermoLens. And DermoLens is essentially a platform that I'm trying to build where you can have this screening tool that can help you make more informed decisions, right? It can't diagnose you, but it can help you make more informed decisions. And over time, the more documentation you build up on your personal profile, you can kind of figure out what's going on, and you can take that information to your dermatologist, have more informed conversations. And maybe you can find some things that you probably didn't see yourself. We have some tools. I'll talk about those tools in future videos, but some tools can help to see if you have any sort of seborrheic dermatitis issue, or a signal, rather, of a seborrheic dermatitis issue, any spots on your scalp, etc., etc. So, I'll put that in the description, and maybe you guys can go try it out, right? You can do the free trial. The basic is 20 and the pro is 40 with more features, more scans, more AI prompting with our fine-tuned LLMs. And it's something to try out. And if you hit me up, I can probably give you guys, maybe like a free pro 1 month trial just to see how things are going, and, you can get an idea of the service. But in any case, the fun part is let's drop this guy's picture here. Let's see what's going on. So I'm going to drop his picture here. We do have like a manual blur kind of tool. I know some people are always anxious about uploading pictures on platforms. So if you had your face or something on it, you could like blur it out manually in your browser. Like for example, we can just blur out the background. I know it's a white background, so you can't see it, but you can kind of like, pixelate it out. So, maybe you have something sensitive you don't want to upload. So look at that. All right, cool. Let's click apply and continue. And, it's saved to gallery, whatever. You can put the age, the sex, male. He said, 20? I'm going to delete this afterwards, just for the purpose of the example that I'm trying to show. Let's do analyze scalp. Let's see what the machine tells us. Okay, so here we have the results. So an 85% confidence of moderate Norwood 3 vertex, and it is pretty much saying go consult with the doctor soon. But the summary is interesting. It says, quote, the image shows noticeable thinning primarily at the crown and mid-scalp, with the scalp clearly visible through the hair. The surrounding hair appears denser, which is characteristic of pattern hair loss, unquote. And I don't think you need a doctor to see that, right? Obviously, that's clearly there. That is the case. But over here, I find it interesting because the likely causes are broken down into androgenetic alopecia, being 90%, and telogenal fluvium, exacerbating AGA. So it's making the AGA look worse, the androgenetic alopecia look worse. And we already know he has some kind of LPP issue because he stated it. So if he were to chat with this tool and give more information, it'd probably give a proper screening assessment. Or if he had an up-close picture of his scalp, the assessment would be a bit different, right? So that's one thing to take into consideration when you use any tool like this. We also have the tool called spot analysis. And with spot analysis, here you can use any camera, right? You can even use a scalp camera, this particular brand that I use myself, but your phone camera should be fine as well. And with spot analysis, we can see any sort of blotchiness, patchiness that's on your scalp, whether it's the skin itself or if it's some kind of, seborrheic issue or skin flaking issue. The limitation here is that if you're under very bright light conditions, then it might mess up with the analysis. But if you're in like a shaded kind of room with some kind of light source, so I can show you some examples. Pictures like this in these sort of lighting conditions are pretty good. So let's do a demonstration. Gallery, I'm going to use my friend's scalp over here. We want to draw on the area so we can focus where we want the analysis to run. The coverage, rather, depends on the scope that you're trying to focus on. I should probably go with a rectangle. Let me use rectangle over here. So I want to focus over here, and I'm going to click detect spots. Okay, so now that we click detect spots, we can see that there's this like pink drawing in that area, right? So if we go over here and we look at the coverage score, it's 31.2% and it's low. But coverage is relative to your scope area, and we point that out over here. I'll just read it to you. So this is not going to represent clinical severity. It's not going to say, okay, well, if it's only 2% coverage, that means, it's not that severe as an issue. No, it just means that given the area we drew out, that we focused on, the spots only cover a certain amount. It doesn't cover everything. It only covers a moderate amount. And because we're kind of using a square over here, right, we can, or rather rectangle, we can see that it's not covering the entirety of the rectangle. If it were, then that would be an issue. But if I were to just simply adjust and make the rectangle smaller, the coverage would go up substantially now that we know where the spots are kind of being sensed. So detect spots, and you can see over here, 55.1% coverage simply because I shrunk our area of focus. In any case, right, we can see without the detect spots, we just simply use our eyes and zoom in. There are some issues with my friend's scalp over here, right? Some inflammatory issues. You can see it over here. A lot of, much of the scalp has like these inflamed follicles. That's one over here, another segment over here. And that's some of the things that the spot analysis can do. It's not perfect, but it can give you a bit of a signal of what's going on. But also, if you already have like shaved your head, it's pretty helpful to use. But if you haven't shaved your head, just part your scalp as best as you can with your fingers and any sort of area that you're having like itchiness or issues with. Use your hands to part your scalp to get that analysis. kind of like the examples that I showed before, right? Those examples being over here. Oops. So as long as you have some visible view of your scalp, again, you can use your hands to part your hair so we can see your scalp, then you can get a better sort of detection of what's going on. So that's pretty much it for this video. And yeah, thank you guys for watching this video. Hopefully this guy is able to properly treat his hair loss issues and he can get the right medication he needs, because he's dealing with LPP and that's pretty serious. But also, I started a company. I know I gotta do my plugs, but I'm trying to, make products that people might find useful. So over here, if you go to the shop page, we have liposomal monoxidil sulfate. We're running it as a cosmetic. And you can get either the 10% concentration or the 5% concentration. At the time of recording this video, the 10% concentration is out of stock, so you can go check it out, maybe put your name in the email list, and when we go back in stock, you should be able to get it, right? So check it out, maybe even try it out. That's at folligens.com, FOLLIGENZ.com, and I'll put it in the description below. So thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.